É todos.
In Paris, the other day it was 47.
45. 1.7, I think.
Good afternoon. This is the sixth edition of the Tiny Lab Talks. The main question today is, can innovation temper climate change? Tiny Lab Talks are a brief, informal talks from people invited by the University of Aveiro and the people from the University of Aveiro itself. Through the American Corner program on topics and technologies of innovation, research and culture. So the conversation will usually take place here at the American Corner Media Lab with the support of the US Embassy Portugal, rethinking and changing the way we see, design and organize the long-term care. So I will briefly present the invited people. So we have Ashley. Ashley is an analyst and a writer and a commenter specialized in transportation safety, regulation policy, and workforce productivity, with over a decade of academic and industry experience. He is a researcher at Harvard University and MIT. Miriam is a researcher integrated at the Research Center of Environment and Marine Studies here at the University of Aveiro. And myself, I'm Antonio Teixeira. I'm the Dean of the Doctoral School and researcher at the Institute of Telecommunications. So to start the topic of can innovation temper the climate change, I open with Ashley. Ashley, why and where do you think innovation will really impact global change?
Well, that's a loaded question.
That's
the point.
The point.
Well, I think technology certainly has the ability to temper some of the effects of climate change. If you look at things like driverless cars and improvements in engine bypass ratios, for example, on board jets that are able to reduce the amount of fuel an airplane requires to travel further. These technologies generally result in reductions in emissions, which in turn can curb the magnitude of climate change. So yeah, certainly the potential is there. That being said, it's not without its own set of challenges. One of those challenges is the fact, of course, that as you improve the energy efficiency of a system, you lower the cost, and when you lower the cost, you increase consumption of a particular good. And that's something that people don't necessarily talk about very often. Yeah, and it's something certainly that policymakers and the public needs to be aware of. It's the equivalent, for example, of insulating your home to ensure there's more heat inside the home and then leaving your window open. Mm-hmm. Right? So again, technology can certainly help temper some of the effects of climate change, but technology alone, presumably, will not allow us to get there.
Okay, Miriam, do you have something to say?
Yes, I would like to say that I agree with your opinion, Ashley. In fact, there are some sectors that we are getting more focus and more attention, like the transportation sector, because it's one of with the highest impact on greenhouse gas emissions. At the same time, a lot of effort was done in the last years, at least in Europe, to control emissions from cars, to develop new technologies. We have very strict standards for cars emissions, and even to long-term perspective, we have regulations regarding maintenance, for instance, that are helping to control this type of emissions. But of course, at the same time, we have some scandals like Volkswagen that reduce a little bit the trust of citizens on this type of approach. But what we see is that at the same time, apart of price things, we have also another effect, that is the increase in population. is much faster, and also the increase on demand is much faster than our ability to improve efficiency. So there is an imbalance in this process, and because of that, in fact, technology needs to play an important role, but is not the only way to go to the point and to fulfill this very hard targets that are those of Roadmap 2050 and to reduce this impact on global warming. So some important aspect is to look to citizens and bring citizens to the equation. So part of this work should be done by changing behaviors.
Oh, that brings me to to the next question, which I think it's very good for the introduction that you did. So, which do you think are the roadblocks for innovation to really the major ones? Like, are they political? Are they social? Are they really technological? Or are them this mismatch of speed in between the two things, the growth of population and the efficiency increase due to technology?
Well, just going to what you were saying earlier, it's important to remember why we should focus on transportation. The reason at a microeconomic level you would focus on transportation is because it is a key driver of upward economic mobility. So when you have access to a car, for example, versus relying on public transit, you have, all else being equal, the ability to access more jobs. The job that you want, sometimes a higher paying job, etc. And to the question you had asked, I'll just go back one about, where could we see potential problems? One of the places we see potential problems, one region of the world is Asia, because you're seeing an increase in the size of the middle class. Their wages are growing, and as a consequence of their wages growing, they want to buy more cars, they want to take planes more, which in turn increases demand for energy. Now, in regards to the roadblocks, so the diplomatic answers, some of them are political, as Emmanuel Macron recently discovered with his diesel tax. Some of them are social, related to consumer behavior, and then some of them are technological. I mean, if you go back to 2009, for example, the price of a battery per kilowatt hour in 2009 was about $700. In 2015, it was about $350, and today the number is somewhere between $150 to $175. So certainly the price of an electric battery has gone down considerably. But the problem with this is that there's only so much of a benefit you can squeeze out of the system before you approach the floor, essentially. Which means that all else being equal, you need to find other ways to drive efficiency, but maybe you have
Yeah, I think, of course, transportation sector is a very important issue, but in my opinion, we need to change from individual to community. So I think that cities should put a major effort on the planning part, because we have the case of Portugal, a part of Lisbon and Porto that have high density, population density. The other cities like Aveiro, we have a very low density. And this is a problem to support public transportation. So we need to have new patterns of development, new planning strategies in order to concentrate people and make transport or public transportation more efficient and more effectiveness in terms of prices, including. So this is one question. This is part of the equation. And then we need to look to other sectors that most of the times we don't think about, like agriculture. Agriculture plays an important role because manure and also some agricultural crops and the use of fertilizers are impacting significantly on climate, because in this case we are not looking to CO2, but we are looking to methane and nitrous oxide and other greenhouse gases, and those gases have even higher impact on the process. And again, if you look to China or India, this will be a huge problem in the future. So we need to improve also technologies in other sectors. And I think we're still having a huge space for technological improvement and the increase of efficiency. But again, this is also an education process. And we need to anticipate also the problem of aging. So old people will need more. In the case of transportation, they will have more needs. So to satisfy this quality of life and to satisfy all the needs we have in modern societies, this will be a huge challenge that we should face. So I think we should put together both things. Technology can play a role, but the planning, policy involving citizens on decision-making process and engage citizens. For instance, we can see on these records from elections that people are not participating. Even in European elections, last only 20% vote. And so those that vote, I vote, and I'm deciding for the other 80% that didn't vote. So this is really a citizen problem, I think.
Oh, yeah, certainly I would concur with that. I mean, you talked about agriculture, right? So if we talk about carbon footprints, for example, we know the carbon footprint of meat is significantly higher than plant-based products. So you see the growth of companies like the Impossible, I think it's called a plant-based meat, right? So in the Impossible Burger, and I think there's one particular company, I think it's called Impossible Meat, that its stock has just skyrocketed completely because they're signing agreements now with major fast food chains to sell these burgers, right, that are not really meat. But again, that being said, it's, the average person perhaps doesn't know that meat has a very large carbon footprint.
And water footprint too.
And water footprint as well,
Yes.
absolutely. But the question then is, if they know that, are they still willing to give up eating meat? I'm not. I like meat.
Me too.
Precisely. So I mean, this is when you talk about communities making decisions together, to me that's a very nice thing to say. But the problem fundamentally, in my view at least, is that for too long energy has been too cheap, and you have whole societies that have been developed on the basis of cheap energy. And now what you're trying to do is, in a span of a very short period of time, you're trying to fundamentally change how people behave, because we are saying there is a climate change threat, and there is. But how do you change that behavior over a span of just a few years when you've had societies that have developed over decades, if not centuries, with access to cheap energy?
I would say that if we join other processes and other problems to the equation, maybe this will help to change people's mentality. For instance, if you bring the question of air quality and the problems related with the impact of air pollution on human health, and there are some very strong figures from the World Health Organization about this, and if you say to people, for instance, in a recent project, we present some figures and we ask Portuguese people in Aveiro region, what you think are the highest level of mortality? Tobacco, air pollution, alcohol, accidents, and most of people say accidents, car crash accidents. And this is not true. This is in fourth place. So the biggest one is tobacco, of course, and the second is air pollution, is the second killer in Portugal. So when you putting these figures in the equation and you join and make a win-win interaction, people realize that they can get advantages for implement some politics, because some politics have double or triple benefits, not only in terms of carbon, but also improving air quality, their own health, and for instance, parents care about children's health, of course, and this is something that you can use. So I think there is also a problem of communication.
Although I would argue that in Europe, the problem you have is that people are not having kids as much anymore.
Yeah,
So,
in Portugal we have this problem too.
Yeah, but most European countries, in fact, most developed countries have this problem. And to your point about road accidents versus things like tobacco, for example, part of the problem there is that when a road accident occurs, you see what the outcome is immediately.
Yes, of course.
Right, versus tobacco that takes longer, or even air quality that takes longer to manifest itself in terms of the health effects. So yeah, I mean, again, these are not these are not easy challenges to address. But I also think part of the problem is political, which is that many politicians, they're not honest with the people about what the near-term impact is of some of these things. But that's also driven by the political system, where many political terms are very short versus being very long. Mm-hmm. And if a political term is short, it means that the politician in that case cares about getting re-elected. Versus having the freedom, if you can use that word, to make decisions that in the short run might hurt the people, but in the long term benefit generations, right? So,
good. So I think we have here the nice audience, and we would like to open also to the audience to if they want to place any question. I think in the YouTube channel there is no question now. Any of you? Okay, so I will do something more.
May I contest something?
Contest.
Not exactly contesting.
No, it's okay.
Just adding something, not contesting, but adding something into this political issue. In fact, this is a huge problem we are facing, and I'm not saying that I'm against democracy and how democratic process is ongoing. I think we need to revise this. For instance, I don't know if you are aware about the last government or the current government we have in Portugal that we call geringonça. This is a very strange word to say that it's a mix of different things, and they try to come to some commitment. So there are three parties that make a kind of agreement in order to make this government.
It's a coalition government.
Yeah, but this is
a very special one.
A very special one. But in fact, they show that it's possible to implement some measures. Some of them, of course, are not very nice for the people, but they are doing some job. In some cases we got some improvements. In other cases people can say that maybe things are not so good. We can always discussing this, but and now again concerning this election for the European Parliament and the European Commission, it was a long debate because things were really divided. But when things are divided, this means that people need to discuss and need to make some reflection. And sometimes we are not doing that. We just adopt measures and implement things. And so I think in this aspect, our system, European system, or most of the European system, are quite different from the American system. Not so different from the Canadian.
Correct,
one.
yes. It's a parliamentary system.
It's a parliamentary system. But I think I agree with you that these short cycles on elections are a handicap on this process to implement strategies that only have effect at long term.
Although one could argue that you need a short term when your politicians aren't necessarily that
to be changed.
Yeah, or not that intelligent, in which case you want the person out as quickly as possible.
So this should be shorter even.
Well, again, it's a trade-off, right? It's they often, you talked about democracy. I mean, some people say democracy is the most unstable form of government,
Yeah.
right? Because it demands that that the citizens are informed about the issues and about the people they're actually voting for. And certainly given the current political climate in the US, one could question the wisdom of some of the choices, the political choices that citizens actually make. But that being said, when you talked about conservation earlier, I mean, people talk about conservation, and yet they go out and they buy, not just in the US at least, they don't just buy one car, they buy multiple cars. So on the one hand, you're talking about conservation, and then you have multiple cars in your garage. Think of all the energy that is used to manufacture the car, drive it around, recycle the car, etc. So, I mean, these are not easy issues to address, but personally, I think citizens should demand more honesty from politicians, and politicians should be willing to be honest about these things.
And maybe they should be responsible or can be responsibilized, I don't know if you say that, for the decisions they make. And in this case, I think most of the times, even if the policies are a disaster, they don't get any responsibility on that.
Sure, yeah, absolutely.
Unless of not being re-elected or something like that.
Yeah, I mean, people talk about climate change. So, as I think someone had written this recently, electric vehicles are in vogue these days, and electric vehicles need batteries, and batteries need metal. And one of the metals that batteries need is cobalt. And much of the cobalt is found in the DRC, the Democratic Republic of the Congo, that has significant human rights issues. So, does the average consumer care about that? Rather than relying, for example, on cobalt in your batteries, you could rely in theory on lithium alone. But the problem with lithium is the fact that the energy density is a lot lower, which means in theory you can go a shorter distance with a lithium-powered battery. Are you willing to live with that inconvenience? Is the average consumer willing to live with that inconvenience?
I think we have space. I believe on the next generation. I believe on the youngest. I believe that young people will do much better than we are doing now. And we have this nice movement around and about strikes for climate. This is really fantastic for me because...
Really? Because my parents say the opposite. My parents tell me that they did better than I did.
No, I don't think so.
Oh,
I don't.
okay.
They
We are
don't.
in a changing point. So
Yes, because they were in the peak of
Okay,
oil.
all right.
I would like to just give these questions that came from the public somewhere in the internet. So Tanya Ribeiro asked, what are we actually doing to fight climate change? That's to you, but quite briefly, because we have another one, and then.
Oh, well, from a political perspective, the Netherlands, for example, is aiming to ban the sale of diesel and petrol cars by 2025. I believe the UK and France is aiming for that by 2040. So, again, this goes to, political levers that are being pulled effectively to change people's behavior. Most recently, we had the carbon tax that was implemented in Canada to essentially get people to think a little bit more about how they burn gasoline. And then from major manufacturers, we see considerable investment in developing so-called green technology that, if you look at studies, might indicate that they're not as green as you think they are, but there is certainly a lot of movement.
I would point out the things we are doing in Portugal, and in terms of energy sector, I liked the strong investment on renewable energy, and this has a double impact. One is, of course, to reduce carbon emissions and fight against climate change. But the second one was to reduce our dependence on external imports of energy.
Sure.
Because Portugal was 100% dependent on fuel and on coal. And so all the energy we use for electricity production, cars and whatever, was imported from other countries. So nowadays we are using our indigenous resources, natural resources like solar and wind generation. So this, I think, was, of course, we have this problem with the technology and the indirect costs related with the materials that we are using, but also we have huge impacts of using oil, because oil, for instance, if you have an oil split, I read this week in newspaper, the last oil split in US is still having a huge impact on biodiversity, much higher than that was expected. So in terms of externalities, when we think on externalities, so the indirect impacts related to this, the use of traditional fossil fuels, this is not accounting in the price of oil. And people don't know, but they're still having some subsidies to the use of oil. So if we use these subsidies to other technologies, I think we could have some policies on this to mitigate carbon emissions. But of course, mitigation is also important as a message to cut also some expenses with adaptation. So if we connect mitigation and adaptation together, this will be an important thing too, because avoiding additional greenhouse gas emissions and additional global warming, we are reducing the future impacts of climate change.
So just to fulfill this, and with 30 seconds, because it just advises what they are asking, Marcia is asking, what advice can you give to what young people can do to make a difference from now? So one advice, good advice that you can think of, one that you can think 30 seconds would be quite good. And
well, I think certainly be more conscious of your energy choices. One way to do this is to not, quite frankly, charge your iPhone so much. Wait until the battery actually dies before you go to charge that, because there's been some interesting research that has been done showing that young people have a tendency to constantly recharge the battery even though it's not full yet. And all these small little behaviors actually add up to something significant.
I think I will be a little bit more dramatic on that. I would say that young people need to read more books, to learn with the past, to learn about our errors, to avoid to make the same errors. So I think young people need information. They should get the opportunity to have this. I should say, I use this in my classes, and I used to say to my students that this is a Bible, this is a library, this is an encyclopedia. They have all knowledge with the touch of a finger. So I think they have now the opportunity and access to information, but they should be critical regarding this information. So they need to learn, and they need to create their own knowledge in order to apply and make better choice in the future. And this, I think, was one of the gaps of our generation.
Great, thank you both for participating. We also would like to thank the support of the US Embassy in Lisbon. The next Tiny Talk will happen soon, so stay tuned on the channel and with our social media, and to attend the next talk. Thank you for coming, the ones here and the ones on virtually. Okay, thank you.
Thank you.